right, well, welcome everyone. We have had a wonderful 2 days in Natchez. My name is Paul Ortiz. I'm director of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, professor of history at the University of Florida. How's everyone doing this evening? All right. All right, so maybe we can get our students to do a gator chomp before the night is over. So we have a real treat tonight. What we have brought with us from the University of Florida is a lot of materials based on our oral history work in African American history, Latino history, civil rights, and immigration histories to a certain extent. So to begin with, we have a lot of handouts. So if you don't have these, and I think we have enough to where we're just going to need to share. So pick these up. I'll just pass them around. One is a teacher's guide, a real teacher's guide, to my most recent book in African American and Latinx history of the United States. And I'll explain why that's relevant to the topic at hand, which is teaching civil rights history. The other one is a 5-sheet handout, or 5 handouts stapled into one sheet, or into one packet rather. That the first one is titled Reasons for Voter Suppression in the 19th Century and Discussing Reparations Today. To understand the civil rights movement, what civil rights history is, we have to understand what people were organizing against, what people were trying to transcend or challenge. And then, having said that, we need to understand why white supremacy, why voter suppression has had such a deep impact and a hold on the United States. So today, some of my students know that earlier I was actually doing 2 different interviews with European media outlets. The last one, French Channel 24, I believe, in which they were asking me about what happened in El Paso last weekend. And one of the things that we talked about was the fact that if you didn't already know that, history is no longer an elective. History is a matter of life and death. And if we didn't know that before El Paso, we certainly know that now. What's happened in this country is there's such a shocking ignorance of the contributions, experiences, struggles of African American and Hispanic or Latino peoples that you can have a young man, the product of American educational system, who believes that Mexican Americans have contributed nothing to the history of this country, and in fact, take things away. That was a belief about Mexican and Mexican Americans, by the way, that was very common when I was a kid growing up in Washington State and California. But I'm also thinking about another society which for its time was the most technologically advanced. This was a society that had the best scientists, the best STEM education programs. It was the most advanced industrial society on the planet. It had the most efficient factories. It produced the best weaponry. It produced, frankly, most of the best technology on the planet. But it did something which destroyed it, and actually almost destroyed the entire world. By now you know which society I'm talking about. Nazi Germany in 1933. There was no other nation on the planet that had such an advanced industrial scientific infrastructure. And yet the Nazi Party was able to gerrymander, tinker, and undermine history to such an extent that they convinced ordinary Germans that Jewish people had made no contributions to German history in the past millennia, which was stunning if you think about this, because even just in one example, World War I, many of the frontline soldiers that fought for Germany were Jewish. Many of the officers who led platoons, many of the highest award winners, people who won 2 or 3 Iron Crosses, were Jewish German soldiers. And yet, German culture was so ignorant of its own history that it didn't acknowledge this, it forgot, and it was easy for people to say, well, Jews made no contribution to Germany, they're outsiders. And to be able to convince Germans that Jews were outsiders is the same kind of remarkable, I like to use the term accomplishment, that we have today. When you think, if you can have people who really think of African Americans or Mexican Americans as outsiders, the reality is most African Americans trace their ancestry here much longer than most European Americans, okay? Most or many Mexican Americans trace their ancestries here as long or more longer than most European Americans. In fact, we had a phrase where I was growing up as a Mexican American, we didn't cross the border crossed us. Exactly. Think if you're an indigenous person, a native person, or if you're an African descent person, you didn't immigrate to the United States, right? So I just wanted to give kind of a quick overview to explain this, the new book that I have out, African American Latinx History of the United States. The book is being used in a lot of high school districts which are trying to really respond to a number of different things. One is the fact that so many of our high school districts now are becoming majority-minority school districts. And I've talked to superintendents and curriculum directors who tell me, Paul, you know, the majority of our district now consists of Hispanic students, white working class students, Haitian American students, East African, Russian, so on and so forth. We need a new curriculum. We can't keep on with the same old curriculum that just talks about Madison, Hamilton, Jefferson, Jefferson, Hamilton, Madison. That's great. And by the way, you'll find those characters in the book, and I'll just pass the book around. It's a ragged copy because I've done over 150 events since that book has come out. And people are hungry for a new kind of history which talks about not just Madison, Hamilton, Jefferson. What did my parents do to contribute to the country? What did my grandparents do? What did my great-great-great-grandparents, how did their lives interact with U.S. history from the very beginning? So if you look at the chapter outline of the book, you'll see what I'm trying to do in terms of getting people to think about a new kind of historical framework. And I start with the Haitian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution is really the most important revolution of all of the revolutions in the Age of Revolutions. When I say Age of Revolutions now, I'm talking about the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the British, you know, or the Glorious Revolution, so on and so forth. The Haitian Revolution is so key because it is a moment of incredible inspiration to all oppressed people throughout the Americas, not just the United States. In the United States, every single one of the early slave revolts, by the way, key on Haiti. They involve African Americans trying to liberate themselves and establish diplomatic relations with Haiti, which has become really the first free independent republic in the hemisphere. And so for example, in 1811, there was a major revolt effort north of New Orleans. Many of you have probably heard about this. The plan was to seize New Orleans, burn down the plantations, declare New Orleans a free port city. It would have been the first free port city in this hemisphere, by the way, and to petition the Haitian government for military protection. And it would have really changed the trajectory of U.S. history, obviously. And so that's why I start with the Haitian Revolution to talk about how U.S. history, see, one of the problems we have, I think, and again, you think about the mass murder in El Paso and what's happened with the rise of white nationalism or the resurgence of white nationalism. My argument is we're going to continue to have a resurgence of white nationalism as long as we have a white nationalist history. And until we can change that narrative and talk about the role of Haiti, Mexico, Cuba, again, at the very outset, the role of Africa, the role of South America, the role of Asia at the very outset, unless we can do that, we're going to continue to have a white nationalist history. Because frankly, friends, that's what we have right now. I mean, I went to grad school at the best history grad program in the country at Duke University, and to be honest with you, it was Madison, Jefferson, Hamilton. Hamilton, Jefferson, Madison, right? And again, nothing wrong with those guys. They did some really good things. They also did some bad things. They're humans, right? But if you only place them at the center and everyone else is a little sidebar, you know, like you all have seen those U.S. history textbooks that say, they have the long passages about how great Benjamin was and others, and then it'll have a box. Women did this. Black people did this. And later, you know, much later, Mexican Americans did this. This book is an attempt to say, no, That's not good enough. If we're either all in, or we're none of us are in. So, having said that, this is just, again, the chapter outline. And I want us to understand, and I want high school kids, and believe me, high school kids are ready for this kind of learning. What I've seen across the country, and I've done high school workshops at Montgomery County, Maryland. I've done workshops in the Central Coast of California, Watsonville High School, which is 90% Chicano, Mexican American. I've done high school history workshops in Chicago. I've done high school history workshops at Corpus Christi, Texas. It's the high school kids who are ready for this new kind of orientation to U.S. history. Why? They live international lives. They don't live a life of American nationalism. They live a multinational life. Their parents may be from Russia, or they may be from Eastern Europe or East Africa. And there's such a large percentage of those students who are excited and thrilled to be told that U.S. history is not a nationalist story, that it's really an internationalist story. So I'm gonna kind of narrow in on a few themes, and then I'm gonna turn the floor over to my colleague, Chris Duryea, who's a real high school teacher, who's gonna talk about teaching civil rights in high school. I'm just an imitation high school teacher for tonight. I'm only a history professor. What does this image represent? Or what, if you were using the image to think about the society, first of all, what is this an image of?
Segregated water fountain?
Yeah, segregated water fountain. 1962, Albany, Georgia. What does it tell us about segregation? There's no wrong answers, right? You're like, he's gonna tell me it's wrong. You know, no, really, there isn't. Yes.
It's based on space, like in someone's proximity to a person of another race.
Yeah, you have spatial segregation here. And interestingly enough, there's closeness here. There's a misconception of segregation that involved the separation of races. That was never what segregation was about. Black and white people interacted in the most intimate terms possible. And yet we still talk about separation. But to me, if you look carefully, and I apologize, it's not the best, it's kind of a grainy portrait. These are connected. They're not separate. There are differences, though.
Today was an interview of Doris Drake, who was part of the Natchez Civil Rights. She said, as she was growing, all this was a natural stuff for her. It was natural for her to accept that the whites would have much better. It was natural. Nobody would question it.
Yeah.
And that's the impression that you got. Bigger, better, the whole works for white.
Yeah, yeah. What else? I heard some other hands too about what the photo tells us.
Just that anyone who's not white is an afterthought. Like clearly, the white one is easier to access, it's taking up more space, and then the other one is just put in seemingly afterwards.
Yeah. This one looks a lot better, right? Probably refrigerated. Probably yes.
To say racism is intentional, and that they made the colored fountain like lower to make people feel less than the white one.
Yeah, excellent. That's. This is an image. Oh, do you have? Okay. This is an image that I use when I'm working with primary, K through 6 students, and some of my colleagues will say, You talk about segregation to 6th graders? And I'm like, yeah. I mean, you've got to start talking to kids about these things. The latest research, by the way, tells us that children begin, imbibing racial attitudes from their parents at the age of 2. Okay? So if we don't deal with things like this, candidly, then kids are going to learn, bad things. But this is one image of segregation which was pervasive. The only thing I'll note here as an exception is that In states like Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, in most cases you would just have this. You wouldn't have a colored alternative. You would just have white. And if it was restrooms, white ladies, restrooms for white ladies and everyone else, and white men, but more often than not, there would not be even a colored option. Okay, so it's important to remember that. I don't want you to leave by thinking that there's always even this kind of multiple option here. But segregation was never about just black and white, ever in the United States, not from day one. These are signs that my father and uncles and aunts grew up with in Houston, Texas, in Florida and other places. And I want us to think about, now I want us to change our mindset, and I want us to think about these from the vantage point of being a parent. Now, being a parent, I can tell you that the most important thing, the most important role, the most important job of a parent is to try to instill a sense of dignity and self into one's children. And I want us to think about what it would mean to be a parent having to take our child or children downtown. Now, my father has visceral memories of these signs. This is a sign that's taken from Texas. He was a busser in a Houston, Texas restaurant with a sign in the very front that said, "No dogs, Negroes, or Mexicans." And as you're thinking about what these signs mean, my father would tell me that the ironic thing was he rarely ever looked at the sign from the front because he wasn't even allowed to go in the front door of his own workplace. As a Mexican-American man, he had to go in the back. And so he'd see the sign, if it was in a glass, kind of front, from the reverse side. So what do these signs tell us about the society which created them?
You asking a question? What was it? I'm sorry, I missed it.
What do these signs tell us about the society of this time period? And as a parent, how would you deal with this kind of sign if you had a child who said, I'm a dog?
I think it was a society based on principles that meant to dehumanize any group of people that wasn't seen as a white Anglo-Saxon at the time. So I think when you're a child and you recognize what that actually means in terms of your identity as one of those marginalized people, that I think as a parent you just want to protect them. I really do. I think.
Yeah.
At least that's what I think.
The greatest living writer in the United States just passed away, Toni Morrison. And those of you who work with high school kids or interact with high school, middle school, or elementary age kids, I highly, highly recommend, and I apologize because I usually have a bibliography of things to read. Have your kids, have your church group, your synagogue, your mosque get together and read a book like Tar Baby. Have them get together and read a book like Beloved by Toni Morrison. These are beautiful, powerful books which go directly into that territory, Sam, that you're talking about. Dignity, what it means to be human. That's really what Toni Morrison taught us. Less about politics and political struggle and more about the struggle for identity and the decisions that parents have to make to try to raise their children with dignity. Just think about the decision that the mother has to make in Beloved. This is the most, grievous kind of serious kind of decision a parent will ever have to make in their entire life. Do I raise my child in the worst possible social system that humanity's ever created, that is slavery, or do I end their lives? Think about that for a moment. Now, these signs batter one's dignity. These signs wear on people. But this is where we get to another side of civil rights history. We know that African Americans and Mexican Americans and Latinos and Hispanics generally fought against these signs from day one. And it's important when we're teaching these things to teach not just about the oppression, but the struggle, the resistance. So the oral history program from UF, we were just in Pensacola last month. Black Pensacola got together and organized a year-long boycott of segregated transportation in 1901 and beat it back. Now, I know you had an incredible boycott here in Natchez, right, in 1965?
1965.
65, okay. So now think about Pensacola, Jacksonville, Florida, Richmond, Virginia, Savannah, Georgia, Atlanta, Georgia, Fort Worth, Texas. All of these cities had months or even year-long battles, boycotts of segregated streetcar transportation. This is before buses, obviously, right? And so from the very beginning, people are fighting back against this. And if we don't acknowledge that in our lesson plans and curriculum about civil rights, struggle against white supremacy, we're only getting half the story. And we're also participating in that kind of dehumanization because we're saying, oh, people just didn't, they didn't know better or they couldn't fight back. We have hundreds of anecdotes and stories in UF's oral history collection where African Americans talk about, and especially women, by the way, and children especially, going to that water fountain during the Great Depression or the 20s, taking a drink. What does white water taste like? Or I'm not going to put up with this. Or, I'm a mother, it's a hot day, we had a long walk to downtown Natchez or downtown Jacksonville or Gainesville, and to help with this. I'm just gonna drink out of that fountain. And were there consequences? Yes. Were they severe? Yes. But I want us to think about the fact that African Americans fought back against segregation from the very outstart.
But another big reference that they could pick up real quick if they haven't is the autobiography of Jane Pittman that was all about drinking out that water fountain.
Exactly.
Almost all. I mean, the defiance that came out of her at such an age was about that water fountain. That was a symbol of really breaking, challenging the white supremacy system, and then the movement that goes with that.
The autobiography of Ms. Jane Pittman, an excellent resource, excellent book. And again, I really highly encourage you. Read these books as individuals, yes, but if you have a community or a faith-based group or a movement organization or the NAACP or anything, pick up one of these books and read them as a group. Talk about them, dialogue about them. So I'm just going to run a couple more slides and then I'll cede the floor to Chris. So this is one handout. The Teacher's Guide to African American Latinx History of the United States. And I'll talk a little more about this later. And again, the other set of handouts, reason for voter suppression, what we're trying to get at here again is why segregation was such a powerful economic system and why it's been so hard to get shed of it. I'll use that old, rural expression, right? Why segregation is so stubborn, if you will. And one of the answers that historians have and that we're getting into high school curricula is that segregation was incredibly profitable from a certain vantage point. Not if you were an African American worker, right? Mr. Box, we were just at, we interviewed a gentleman, co-founder of the Deacons for Defense chapter in Jonesboro, Louisiana. And he told us that in the system of segregation, as a black sawmill or pulp worker, paper mill worker, you would be paid maybe 50% of the wage, the salary, that your white male counterpart would be paid often. If you were a female seamstress like Rosa Parks and you worked in a small firm in Montgomery, you'd be paid about 45 to 50% as your white female co-worker. Now think about that for a moment, what kind of system that is. And then take the handout here, and this actually does get into schools. On about page 3, or about the third handout, I have a thing called Education Taxes and Disenfranchisement. And I won't go over this school by school, but I've taken snapshots using the census of schools in Florida and North Carolina, I think both in 1930, if I'm not mistaken. That's correct, 1930. And you can see here expenditures per pupil, expenditures per school are radically different. Black parents and white parents are being taxed for the schools. Those aren't segregated. But the outcome of that taxed money is sure as heck being segregated. And so the white schools are and here I'm not trying to make the claim that white schools were all that. If you went to Duryea Springs in a white school in 1930, it was very different than going to a white school in Atlanta, Georgia, right? If you go to a white school in Jackson, Mississippi, it's very different than going to a white school in Indianola, Mississippi, in the Delta. But the point here is that this is also a critical part of segregation and why it was so hard to fight against it. It was profitable from a certain vantage point, and it really made white people feel that, oh, we have something invested here in the system. We have something to defend. Who would want to give up this incredible advantage for one's children? I'm asking us to almost kind of suspend our moral judgment for the moment. And again, think about this from the perspective of a parent. Wouldn't we all as parents want our children to have a lot of resources for their schooling? And if someone came to you and said, let's equalize the resources, how many of us would say, oh yeah, let's do that. That's a great idea. But these are the types of struggles that people had to wage in the civil rights movement. And so just concluding this part of my presentation, voter suppression's economic payoff. Voter suppression is a continuing problem in the society. It's rooted in the Jim Crow era, but it's rooted back to the very beginning of US history. What I mean by this, and this is some of the work I've been able to do with school districts, is to tell teachers and give them materials, unfortunately I don't have them here, but materials that demonstrate that from the very beginning, our founding fathers did not plan for 90% of the people in this room to have anything approaching equal citizenship. Not even close. If you look at the 1791 Naturalization Act that Jefferson and the others framed as a rider to the US Constitution, that Naturalization Act sets the terms on which new people coming to the United States become citizens. What are the criteria for the new people coming to the US to become citizens? You gotta be white. There's no exceptions. It doesn't say you gotta be white, but. There's no buts there. You've got to be white. And that law, by the way, is not really overturned really until the mid-1950s, and some would say not until the 1965 immigration reforms. So from the very beginning, it's a racialized, ethnicized system of citizenship that's only going to allow a certain group of men to really have equal citizenship plus voting rights, okay? The voting rights part of this is connected to the economic component. And there's a lot of great materials online now, and in fact, all of this material, when I do a workshop with teachers, I'll show them how to kind of link to this stuff online. This demonstrates here, and I'm not gonna read this, again, that profitability of Jim Crow. But you can't have a system like this unless you take the voting rights of black and brown people away from them. What I mean is, you can't have sheriffs and police setting up roadblocks on state boundary lines or county boundary lines, kidnapping young black men and women and forcing them to work for plantation owners if they have political rights. Because if they have political rights, they're gonna vote you out of office. I mean, I would. I mean, you imagine if you're trying to go to work one day and the sheriff kidnaps you and says you're gonna work for Jeremy in that tourist industry that he's got going, right? I don't care what job you have, you're gonna work for him because he's more powerful. And he's a white dude. And that's the kind of system, or that's what this sequence of events is telling us. This was ubiquitous all across the South. Young black men and women, especially being kidnapped. One of our greatest plays by August Wilson, Joe Turner's Come and Gone. Magnificent play. Joe Turner's Come and Gone, the premise of it, and by the way, it's school ready. Middle school students can read this play. High school students can read this play. It's about a young black man who, and this is early post-Reconstruction, 1880s, he gets up, he's going to or from work, he's kidnapped by a sheriff. The sheriff says, you got to work for 7 years for this plantation owner, he needs labor. The young man has no recourse. His people have no political rights. They've lost their right to vote. And then the story really opens at the end of that 7 years. And he has to find his family. Where has his wife and children gone? They've left the South. They went north. And if you know August Wilson, you know where they've gone. They went to Pittsburgh, of course. Okay, that's where all the stories are set. But this is, again, one of the reasons why Jim Crow is such a hard thing to fight past, because it has an incredible payoff for powerful people. I mean, who would give up that kind of power? I mean, I would if I had it. And the only way to get people to give up that kind of power is to struggle and to fight and to boycott, right? To go on strike, to take up arms if you have to. And we've been doing, thanks to Mr. Boxley, interviewing a lot of members of the Deacons for Defense. And they're very clear about this. Many of them were union shop stewards, Mr. Boxley, right? Many of them were union shop stewards trying to get equal job opportunities
Yes, yes,
for their fellow workers, right?
yes. Certainly, this was a common struggle. Of course, it's what everyone wanted. It's simple, like they say. Today, you listen to them talk, we're just trying to get equal pay. No, it wasn't trying to do all the things that other people imagined that they wanted to do. They just simply want equal and fair play. Justice.
Yeah. It's interesting how in all these interviews in the past several days, there's one term that never shows up ever, that I could be mistaken, a term that I never heard any of the people we interviewed, any of the activists use. I didn't sit in that last interview, was the term integration. People weren't interested in that by and large across the South. It was equality, equal opportunities, right? So right now, I'm going to cede the floor to my colleague, Chris Duryea, and let me say a few words of introduction. Chris is a UF graduate. She did a lot of work with the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, including going on this trip as a student. I always knew Chris was going to succeed and be brilliant in society. In fact, she has surpassed that. She's been an outstanding teacher in different parts of Baltimore and the kind of the larger Baltimore area schools. And I asked her to come back home, if you will, come back to your academic home, to really interact with our students and because we're always trying to think about how can we connect these oral histories, this archival research, with classrooms, with communities, with faith communities. And Chris is doing an outstanding job doing that. And so without further delay, I'll ask Chris to come to the front. Oh, and I apologize, actually. You probably know where we're at.
I got it.
You got it, okay.
Good afternoon, evening. Real quick while I'm setting this up, actually one thing Dr. O said that stuck out to me a little bit is looking around, as of 1800, not a single person in this room would have been able to vote. I think he said like 10% or something. There's not a single person in this room that would have been able to cast a vote in 1800. But, all right, so I'm going to start with a really quick, this was on the news in Baltimore in November 2016.
The house of the nation's first African-American Supreme Court justice is up for sale, and some community activists want to preserve it. Thurgood Marshall's home on Division Street here in Baltimore is privately owned. Several people want to at least preserve the building's exterior and make the building a historic designation.
It is imperative that we get the mayor, the president of the city council, and the council in general to designate this property as historic. And if once it's designated as historic, we won't have to revisit whether or not this house can be torn down.
The property owner has to make the request that the exterior part of the home be designated historic. If city council agrees, then the activists say it's easy to get the proper designation.
Sorry. All right. So Thurgood Marshall is a Baltimore native. Most people are familiar with Some of the things that he's done. In 1946, working for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund team, Thurgood Marshall won acquittals for 23 of the 25 black veterans arrested in the Columbia, Tennessee race riot. These men were charged with crimes ranging from rioting to attempted murder. After the acquittal, Marshall's car was stopped by local law enforcement known to work with the Klan. Marshall was put into the back of the police car and driven down a dark dirt road towards the water where, the NAACP lawyers have been told during the trials, they'd end up swinging from a tree. Marshall was saved when fellow NAACP lawyers, both white men, followed the police car and interrupted the abduction. Marshall later recounted in an interview that they were taking me down to the river where all the white people were waiting to do a little bit of lynching. Things Thurgood Marshall's more commonly known for are his efforts arguing before the Supreme Court in the case of Brown versus Board of Education, which is why we have desegregated schools today, legally. And he was the first African American appointed to the Supreme Court in 1967. The airport in Baltimore is named after Thurgood Marshall. But this is the home he grew up in, and it sold in November of last year for $85,000. 2 years ago, I taught at Dr. Carter G. Woodson Elementary Middle School in Cherry Hill, Baltimore. Dr. Woodson was the second African American to get a PhD from Harvard University, and he was the dean of Howard University. He worked to preserve the history of his people because he believed the contributions of African Americans, quote, were overlooked, ignored, and even suppressed by the writers of history textbooks and the teachers who used them. Dr. Woodson started Negro History Week in 1926, which later evolved into National Black History Month every February. I was able to take my students on a field trip to Carter G. Woodson's house in DC in 2017. And it was pretty commonly promoted in our school that Dr. Woodson was the father of Black history. But when we went to the museum and one of the curators there asked why, none of my students could explain it. Carter G. Woodson Elementary Middle School was a kindergarten through 8th grade school with 2 certified teachers above the 4th grade, myself being one of them. Students of multiple grades were commonly packed in a classroom with any adult we could find to supervise them in the room, and they watched movies because we couldn't get enough subs to actually come to the school. I can think of maybe 4 substitute teachers that were willing to come to the school all year. My 8th graders had not had a certified teacher for 4 years since the 4th grade. During 2017 and 2018 when I worked there, students from 5th to 8th grade received no certified instruction in English or science. I teach social studies. 7th and 8th graders received 2 months of certified math instruction when they went across the street to the high school. That lasted a couple months until they were asked not to return because they were too disruptive. Much of the school had no AC. Several rooms were intermittently locked down because of mold contamination, and every single water fountain in the school had a sign that says don't drink because the water contained dangerous amounts of lead. The school closed in June of 2018. This is how my kids remember Carter G. Woodson. This is the legacy of 2 African Americans in Baltimore, Maryland, one of the oldest predominantly Black cities in America. Marcus Garvey said, "A people without knowledge of their past history, origins, and culture is like a tree without roots." How can we teach children of color to take pride in themselves if we don't teach the value of the things done by those who came before them? How do we teach all children to recognize the value of each other if we don't teach about the diversity of accomplishments that make up American history? The erasure of different narratives within this country's history promotes the idea that American history is the same as white history, when nothing could be further from the truth. Textbooks often portray the wave of history, or the wave of immigration in the early 1900s as creating an American melting pot. But little space within those same textbooks is devoted to recognizing more than token accomplishments from people of color. If students only see the accomplishments and influence of white Americans, how can we expect them to reach any other conclusion than that white people are somehow better than others? These misplaced attitudes of superiority too often influence acts of violence committed against people of color, even as recently as this week. While the increasing number of shootings can be seen watching the news, there are countless other acts of violence against minority groups that do not make it into textbooks or headlines. We visited the lynching memorial earlier this week. And I'm pretty sure every single person who was on that trip learned of some other horrific detail that they were not previously aware of. If students are not made more aware not only of the accomplishments of diverse groups of Americans, but also of the atrocities and acts of violence that have been committed against these groups, if students are aware of these, it's harder to continue that narrative of white supremacy. Instead, students are more likely to recognize the struggles of their peers and their commonalities instead of their differences. Incorporating diverse narratives into the teaching of American history is essential to fostering these connections and promoting empathy. When young people work together as equals to accomplish change, the effects of their actions can resound for decades. To end with the words of Haile Selassie, history teaches us that unity is strength and cautions us to submerge and overcome our differences in the quest for common goals. And I'm going to go back to Dr. O. There you go.
Thank you, Ms. Duryea. So I'm just going to go for about another 10 or 15 minutes and open up for questions. And I wanted to just do a quick run through and to talk about now, just kind of finish up this thought about voter suppression, where it comes from, where it came from, who promotes it, and then transition into concluding really with African American visions of democracy in the late 19th and early 20th century, certainly the prelude to the modern civil rights movement. So there were a number of people promoting the disenfranchisement of African Americans, the disenfranchisement of Mexicans, of immigrants from Europe, and they tended to be powerful industrialists. People like Andrew Carnegie. I'm not going to read this quote. Andrew Carnegie was very popular in Florida during the Jim Crow period, which is interesting because he didn't, I don't think he spent much time in Florida. He didn't have a business in Florida. But the Southern elite loved Carnegie and people like him. Why? Carnegie was always talking about we need to restrict the right to vote. Too many people have the right to vote. And what's so amazing about this quote is the lie that's at the center of it. What is Carnegie claiming here? Only residents among them can give a true impression. Andrew Carnegie never lived next to black people. He never lived in a black community. So how could he make this statement? I mean, how could people even believe this guy? Other than the fact he's the most powerful industrialist of his time. Charles Francis Adams, great-grandson of U.S. President, U.S. Secretary of State. U.S. elites, we might call them now the 1%, have the same dim view towards democracy that most of them have now, frankly. And if you kind of drill down into what Charles Francis Adams is saying, and John Adams would agree heartily with him, you give all these people the right to vote, you're going to create a Celtic, an Irish proletariat in the Atlantic coast, an African proletariat in the shores of the Gulf, a Chinese proletariat on the Pacific. Now, we elite people would not want that, would we? We don't want all these different people having rights and responsibilities and privileges and things like that. So doing history well really means coming to grips with who has promoted democracy in this country and who has tried to destroy it and absolutely crush it. When we think of how we want to teach the civil rights movement, I think that the interviews we've done in Natchez, certainly the ones we've done in Florida and other states, again, get us to the economic foundations of the civil rights movement. And you can imagine how much more compelling this strategy would be in a place like Baltimore or Tacoma, Washington, or East Los Angeles in under-resourced schools to teach the civil rights movement not as a movement where black people wanted to be next to white people, but a movement where black people are trying to get better jobs, better working conditions, better physical plans, right? John Lewis, when he talked about the civil rights movement at the March on Washington in 1963, he's talking about economic justice issues. And the documents are there, the brilliant speeches. If you're a teacher, an educator, a faith-based religious leader, and you want to teach that magnificent March on Washington, Get that speech by A. Philip Randolph, that speech he gave. Get that speech by John Lewis. And what Randolph says is so illuminating. What is voting going to do for us if we allow profit-geared automation to continue to take jobs away from our industrial base? Because by 63, it's already well advanced. Plants are closing every day in Detroit, Michigan in 1963, in Pontiac, in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, in Homestead, Pennsylvania. Plants are closing on a weekly and daily basis. And A. Philip Randolph sees this. He's like, we're going to struggle for voting rights and the franchise and all these great things, but if we allow our economy to get away from us, we're not going to have anything left. Now go to a big city today and tell me whether or not A. Philip Randolph's prophecy did or did not come true. That's why the subtext to the March on Washington is what? The March on Washington for what?
Jobs and freedom.
Jobs and freedom. Because your computer is fighting back against me. No, it's okay. Let's see. Okay, so just a quick review. Haiti, a powerful example. You can imagine we've used this, I've seen this being implemented, and by the way, this lesson is in the teacher's guide. The impact in South Florida of placing the Haitian Revolution at the center of a school in a place like Miami-Dade or Broward County, or even schools in eastern North Carolina, which have an increasing number of Haitian American students. This great moment, and this is a speech, by the way, you can get online. Frederick Douglass saying, we love William Lloyd Garrison and the great British abolitionists and all the others, love John Brown, but we as Negro people know darn well, and this is in 1893, who we really owe our freedom to, the Haitians. Massive applause, because in 1893, people know that. Now, do they know that? No, they do not, because we have an education system which has trained people to look away from Haiti or to look at it askance. That's why when we teach history at the high school or college level, the first thing you've got to do with your students is to dissuade them from the idea that they are smarter than their peers were in 1893 or 1993. Because that audience that Frederick Douglass had knew something that most Americans today, that 99%, I guarantee, of Americans today don't know. The pivotal role that Haiti plays in the freedom movement in this country. I am the faculty advisor for a lot of different Hispanic and different student organizations in Florida. One of them is the Venezuelan Student Association. And I love talking to students. We have a very large Venezuelan diaspora at UF. Where was the Venezuelan flag first raised? Not in Venezuela. The Spanish would have executed you, right? Haiti, because Haiti is a beacon of liberty for all oppressed people. Haiti is the place that Antonio Maceo, that Jose Marti, that Simon Bolivar, the list goes on, go to when the Spanish or the Portuguese or the Dutch or the British or the French kick them out, expel them. You know, where does Jose Marti go after he is expelled from Cuba? Haiti and Mexico. Check it out, Haiti and Mexico. I was just in Mexico City. The house he stayed in, Jose Marti, is a shrine. Because people are making these connections, right, between the struggle for freedom in one country and the other. Mexico. We've got to put Mexico at the center of the U.S. historical narrative. It's where it belongs from the outset. No more El Pasos, no more of this, well, Mexicans are newcomers, they're takers. The Mexican Constitution sets the context for abolition in the United States. In 1813, even before Mexico has achieved its independence from Spain, it's talking about emancipation, total emancipation. Even before, and by the way, the Mexican War of Independence runs from 1810 to 1821, even at a point where it looks like really Spain is actually going to win this war, the freedom fighters of Mexico are encouraging African American slaves to come to Mexico, and they're granting them sanctuary, and they're getting their freedom. Probably more so in this period of time than even in Canada. And we know this because this is the time when the U.S.-Mexico border first becomes militarized by the Texas Rangers and other units designed to try to stop black people from fleeing for sanctuary in Mexico. Mexico abolishes slavery in 1828, a full abolition of slavery, and it's public enemy number one of the United States. You can't have two nations side by side, one free and the other slave, right? Very powerful example. To teach history well, you can't just teach everything as a foregone conclusion. And in the second chapter of African American Latinx history of the United States, this is one of the major case studies. And people have asked me what my favorite part of researching and talking about this book has been, and this is one of those moments. An incredible moment in world history. Jose Maria Morelos, a former priest who turns against the church, becomes a revolutionary general. Probably the finest revolutionary general in the 19th. I can get into arguments with colleagues about this, right? Because someone might say Maceo or Bolivar and others. Morelos beats the Spanish at their own game for a while. But he realizes that Mexico by itself, or the United States by itself, are not strong enough to deal with Europe. We have to be united. And so he sends a number of emissaries to President Madison and other American diplomats to try to create an alliance. And it's a pretty compelling argument, because what Morelos and others say to their counterparts in the United States is, War of 1812, y'all. The British came into your own backyard and burned your capital to the ground. Now, I don't know about you, but if another power comes into my country and burns my capital to the ground, I've kind of lost that war, right? Historians teach all this stuff about the Battle of New Orleans, which is great, love it, everything, but it's like the British came, and they say even Madison didn't even know where the Constitution was. He thought the British had burned it up. Luckily, another person had grabbed it and speared it away. That's how total the defeat was. But Morelos, to be serious, so Morelos is offering Madison, and these are long letters, offering him an alliance. You know the Europeans are going to be back. You know they want your land. You know they want your shipping lanes. You know that they're impressing your sailors. They're kidnapping sailors to serve in the British Army. You can't deal with them alone. We can't deal with them alone. The French are constantly trying to invade Mexico. Imagine what could have been a real alliance between Mexico and the U.S. in 1815. Imagine the kind of world we live in today if that happened. That's what I mean by teaching contingency. Get your students, our students, to think about what could have been. It didn't have to turn out that American leaders like Herbert Hoover. I mean, some people ask me about Donald Trump all the time. I'm like, Donald Trump has nothing on Herbert Hoover. And let me explain what I mean by that. When the Great Depression started, who did the Hoover administration blame it on? Global capitalism? No. Mexicans, of course. We're always to blame for every bad thing that happens, right? Why not the Great Depression? And so the U.S. deports 1 million Mexican Americans to Mexico. Many of them have been U.S. Citizens for generations since the U.S. invasion of Mexico. Why not blame Mexicans? So a new kind of historical curriculum has to get us past that kind of blaming and divisiveness that is so common now. So the Haitian Revolution, again, at the center. There's some tools in the book and a lot of curriculum now that talk about the connectivity of freedom struggles, the connectivity between the American Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, the Mexican War of Independence. That's what I'm trying to get across to my students. Don't think about these as isolated incidents. There's important connections. We know now that there's a certain number of Haitian freedom fighters in Mexico in 1813 fighting against the Spanish. We know that the Haitians are in the American Revolution fighting against the British. We know that, again, Antonio Maceo from Cuba is in Haiti for a time. Jose Marti is in Haiti for a time. In other words, these struggles for freedom are connected. I'm going to skip over this and kind of move to a conclusion. The other important thing to acknowledge in our history is the history of imperialism. And Frederick Douglass is the person who, among many other people, did this to talk about why the Civil War happened. I think as teachers, we need to really get to the whys. We talk a lot about the hows. Our students can talk about dates. We got to drill much deeper in terms of why things happen, what they meant to people. And Douglass is, and I'm not going to read this, but Douglass is telling us that the Civil War was only a matter of time. And because the U.S. waged war against Mexico, it refused to recognize Haiti and Liberia. We attacked Native Americans relentlessly. We gave the power to slaveholders to relentlessly expand the system of slavery. We brought this war on ourselves. This is what Douglass is saying. And he's saying that the North is just as culpable and guilty as the South. What Malcolm X said, stop talking about the South, right, Brother Jeremy? Malcolm X said, you're south of the U.S.-Canadian border, you south, right? Douglass is saying that in a different kind of context. One of the things when I work with high school teachers is I try to help them get beyond the misconceptions about certain social systems, slavery being the foremost among those. One of the myths that will prevent any student or any person from understanding slavery in the United States is the idea that slavery was some kind of archaic social economic system. It was the most advanced economic system in world history. It was the most profitable economic system in world history up to that point. And just the value. Now, I've given this away, but Julian and some of my other students know I asked my students to guesstimate to me how much wealth was in slaves in trillions of 2016 dollars by the time the Civil War broke out. How much in dollars were enslaved people worth? Was slavery really dying out? Was it really a backward system? The chart says that at the eve of the Civil War, the value of slaves was approximately $13 trillion. That's just in enslaved people. It's not in all the products that they are producing. Okay? Slavery was not dying out. It was never going to die out without what people like Frederick Douglass and Garnett and others said was needed at that point, which was another revolution. And that's what the Civil War was. Because slavery was just too valuable again to get shed of. I don't think there's anyone living who runs an economy who would just say, I'm going to throw away a system that's worth $13 trillion. Just wouldn't happen. I mean, you like to think there are people like that, but probably not. I'll close on this. The visions of freedom that African Americans had were so astonishing. I have one chapter that's just on Reconstruction, and that's the chapter, by the way, that high school teachers and social studies curriculum directors have really zeroed in on. Because in the midst of this life and death struggle for equality, when African Americans are fighting the Klan in Reconstruction, when they're fighting for equality, for land especially, above all else, they're also thinking about what's happening in the world beyond their immediate city or county. And Henry Highland Garnett and Douglass and others get together at the end of the Civil War, and a lot of white abolitionists in the North are saying, we're tired. Mr. Douglass, we've been fighting for generations here. You know, many of us have been physically beaten. We carry the scars of being lifelong veterans against slavery. Let's disband the American Anti-Slavery Society. And Garnett and others say, no, What kind of people would black people be if we disbanded the Anti-Slavery Society when millions of our brothers and sisters are in bondage in Brazil, in Cuba, when we don't even know if serfdom is really going to end in Russia. We're not even sure slavery is going to end in the United States. You can say something has ended in 1865, but it's just like saying make schools equal in 1954. Did that Supreme Court decision really mean anything, right? And so in the midst of this life and death struggle to survive, black communities across the entire country organized a movement for the abolition of slavery in Cuba. And in the end gathered as many as 500,000 signatures petitions that Frederick Douglass and others presented to Ulysses S. Grant. The U.S. needs to be involved in what's happening in Cuba. And I won't read these, but these are just like broadsides. Baltimore, by the way, was a center of agitation for building what I call the Cuban Solidarity Movement. There's a reason why President Trump attacks Baltimore. Baltimore has always been at the center of U.S. history. It was at the center of the transatlantic slave trade and the domestic slave trade, but it was also at the center of what? The Underground Railroad. And people still find on a regular basis cellars in Baltimore when people start digging, right? Harriet Tubman, Garnett's family from the Eastern Shore, Douglas from the Eastern Shore, Maryland. Baltimore is ground zero. We either win in Baltimore or we lose everything. And that was true at the beginning of the country. This is the first place that people in the U.S. heard about the Haitian Revolution at a seaport. So we, the colored citizens of Philadelphia, having met in mass meeting, consider the condition of Cuba, resolved that the oppressed of Cuba we have the warmest sympathy for, the patriots now in arms we have admiration, and for the rulers of Spain we have only indignation. My students get so excited when they read this stuff. They're like, dang, people cared about what was happening in Cuba up here? That's amazing. And it's really inspirational to them. And I'll conclude on this, because this fits in with that, again, that idea of the civil rights struggle as an international struggle. I won't read this, but Dr. Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois, talk about the first Harvard black PhD, in the 1920s, and by the way, how many NAACP members here? Okay, so we'll do the membership a little later, pitch later. This is a speech, excerpt of a speech that Du Bois gives in the 1928 National NAACP Convention in Los Angeles. And it's a great broadside, those are your teachers, to have your students read, because it's talking about, from Du Bois's perspective, why we black people are fighting for the right to regain the right to vote. Not just for ourselves, but for people all over the world, okay? And what he says in the full, I actually don't have the full quote here. Oh yeah, okay, here's a larger excerpt. When Du Bois is at that NAACP convention in 1928, he said that when we lost the right to vote, this country became corrupt almost beyond redemption. And this is reason number one, we have to regain the right to vote. And equally important, we have to regain the right to vote because we have to see ourselves in tandem with people in Haiti, Nicaragua, Cuba, the Philippines, and Hawaii, because all of these people are suffering under the yoke of colonialism, in which our country is integral. India, Egypt, and then we can go on this. But again, giving people a speech like that, I remember high school students in Watsonville, California, looking at this and saying, "Where was this dude Du Bois from, man? He really had it going on." He seems to have this really incredible, imagination about thinking about freedom broadly. And I think I'll go and conclude there. If we want to have questions or time for discussion, thank you for being a fabulous, patient audience. Any thoughts or? Yes.
Oh, I go back to Chris and the horrible stuff you're talking about in those compacted neighborhoods, like where she's working now. There were some university professors maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago who had done studies, and of course the studies that they did, they say instilling black pride in African American students helped them to do better academically. Well, those of us who in the late 60s and through the 70s and what have underwent the transformation from the Negro culture, the colored folks culture, whatever, to an African culture, we understood this very much so that this was what we were standing on, that was making us taller and giving us pride and what have you, and it's lasting. However, the findings of those university professors in that study is, I keep wondering how it's being addressed and implemented, especially in the home where the black history and what have you is not known to, how you're going to instill pride in the black children in early age if you don't have pride in the history and what have you of your own, not at your own fault, but even at your own fault. How are you going to do this?
Yeah.
And so we find solutions, and they go on here, and you take a school system right here. It's not designed to teach and instill black pride into children, and the churches are not designed to do that. The government is not designed to do that. So how do we address this situation when right in front of you, you've been told that this is a solution that will instill great pride and what have you in your children? Okay,
Yeah.
what I've been looking at, all of the type of horror stories, shootings and what have you that's happening within the African American community, my observation is that they are not coming out of schools that teach African Central history and whatever, and those kinds of schools. And I haven't done any study on it, but I can verify, I can vouch for it, because we have worked with schools and built schools that teach an African holistic curriculum, and those students come out and they don't go out and do all this horror story stuff that we see happening, And of course I know it would be the policy of a white supremacist government not to have the schools instill this pride and understand discussion.
Yeah.
But right in front of us, we have answers. And we have an African American population that don't want to turn to the African piece. They still want to, praise Jesus, look to God, or find some other kind of solution, or criticize the school system for failures or whatever the case may be. But an answer, we develop an answer from the 60s right on through up.
Yeah.
In terms of the African curriculum development, the holistic African teaching, whatever.
All the studies tell us, those studies you're mentioning were done in the 60s and 70s, but we even have a newer generation of studies. All studies on education and achievement tell us that yes, when you teach, when you instill pride in people's histories, and you talk about history more holistically, and you show respect for people's cultures and talk about where those cultures come from, kids do better. That is not even debatable. Let me give you one example from the Mexican American educational vantage point. So, Tucson Unified School District in the early 2010s, Tucson Unified, in Arizona, developed a Mexican and Mexican American studies curriculum, which they infused the history and the study of Mexican and Mexican American culture across not just history, but language, math, talked about the Mayan accomplishments of math, which in many ways were far superior to any other culture of the time, and just infused, and now this is middle school and high school. This is not college or universities. And they ran this curriculum, teachers did, for several years. and a number of colleges of education came to Tucson Unified to study the educational outcomes of this program. And what they discovered was that students immersed in this program had higher retention rates, lower absentee rates, higher matriculation to college rates, higher GPAs, you name it, they had it. It was an incredibly successful curriculum. What did the school district do to that curriculum in 2014?
But that
They banned it.
and the lesson
Yeah.
plan of the white supremacy domination system, school system.
Yeah, well,
Yeah, Betsy DeVos or whoever, those people would throw that stuff out.
they banned it.
Yeah.
Better
At
than
the
that.
same time,
Yeah.
Charter schools is the best opportunity to teach that. You know,
Well, it
people
could-
have all this debate about
Yeah.
charter schools say we can teach our own.
But,
we,
okay.
we're not taking advantage of that.
But let me say one more thing about Tucson Unified, though, and then and one comment about charter schools. So, because I do work with a lot of charter schools, and I will say at best mixed, because there's some charter schools that have worse curriculum on history than some of the worst public schools. But the thing about Tucson Unified is this: the school district banned that curriculum. The parents took the curriculum out into the neighborhoods and communities, into community centers, and as under-resourced as they were, continued to try to teach it, filed suit against the state. The district court, I think the Ninth Circuit, actually recently told Tucson Unified, you can't ban this because you don't like Mexican American culture and studies, and that's what they said in the decision. It's the only time I think I've ever seen a federal judge say, y'all are racists. You ban this because you're racists. It was really incredible. But what's happened since that time, it caused a backlash. And I don't think the Tucson Unified school administrators understood what they were doing, because in the wake of that, now all throughout California and a lot of states out west and even the Midwest are demanding ethnic studies curriculum. So we're in this incredible moment, I think, a possibility. And your question is?
I've been a teacher at a charter school in Louisiana for the past 5 years. I'm leaving that now to go to the community college here. And I'll be honest, I could stand in front of that class and teach African American history, which I have a lot of it in my curriculum. And it's the African American students who put their heads on their desks.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want to hear. They don't want to participate in our Black History program. It is the most frustrating thing as a teacher to see children not even.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
And I find that
but
here.
it's the wrong thing going to them. It's the wrong thing going to them. You know, I know exactly, because I've dealt with slavery for 24 years in this district, and I go to the schools in Louisiana, Mississippi, and as soon as I mention slavery, African American children's head go down on the shit. But when I show them what enslaved people did to the slave master, and when I tell them about being part of a history that's 2 million years old versus 200 or 400 years old, and ask them which history do they identify with, they say the 2 million year history over the 400 years of America. That's the way you're going to get them up.
Yeah. Well, it has to be not just in one place. I mean, as a teacher, you can only do so much. It's got to be, and what I notice in Natchez, because we've been coming here each summer now for, Kathy, about 5 years, is you have this incredibly vibrant historical community where you're doing these things. There's a reason you do those Civil War commemorations of Black Union soldiers.
Yes.
There's a reason you get up in front of your class and talk about Black history. There's a reason that museum, the African American History Museum, is there. There's a reason that this exhibit is here, which I would love to get to Florida, by the way. It's a great exhibit.
Oh.
Because it has to be, you know, and look, we didn't, and to be honest with you, Chris and I weren't even planning to present tonight, so I have to apologize. Mike Brandon was originally going to present. Mike couldn't make it. He was an incredible award-winning teacher. His car broke down in Athens, Georgia. So that's why there's a little bit of the ad hoc, but I didn't want to start with that because I hate when people do that, like they make excuses. But having said that, it's got to be, like in basketball terms, a full court press. It's got to be here. It's got to be at the museum. It's got to be in the synagogue. It's got to be, because you can't just put that pressure on teachers alone. you or Chris, you're under too much pressure. That's my observation as a university professor. High school teachers, middle school teachers, primary school teachers under too much pressure in this society. Okay?
To pass some tests or something.
And the testing regime has killed us.
Some common test that somebody said in the white supremacist designing, saying this is the standard for a country. But on the other hand, the Asians, and I watched it in San Mateo, California, as I was there going through the years of California, and I saw a young man in a magic show or something, a young Asian. He's talking about how he learned Chinese and what have you, because he had to go to Chinese culture school on the weekend. Well, that's the same thing I saw in San Mateo 40 years ago, in San Mateo, where the Chinese and the Japanese in the community. They go to the public school Monday through Friday, and Saturday and Sunday they go to the Chinese or the Japanese school to learn that culture and teach it, and they excel in school beyond believability.
Yeah.
That's again an application of your culture and what have you that will instill the pride and what have you. But that doesn't happen in the African American community collectively. It doesn't happen at the hands of that. There's more teaching about, well, we were there this morning, okay. There's more Bible study than there is about our history and whatever the case might be. If we could teach and would teach it, and we could do it, every church turned into a tutorial program in our own history, what have you, it'd begin to solve a whole bunch of problems tomorrow.
Yeah.
But that takes a state of consciousness. That takes a state of awareness.
Well, I think it's music too, right? It's poetry, it's hip hop, it's murals. I mean, when I go to East LA, for example, which I love, I mean, every Chicano person, to be honest with you, I'm just going to give you some chisme, some gossip here. Every Chicano wishes they had been born and raised in East Los Angeles. That's right. And why? And why is that? Look at the public art that working class Chicano people have created in East LA. Murals that are only, that are, I mean,
cultura, it's refrescante.
Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, in the backyards, in the music, in the poetry, but the murals. I'll just commend to your attention the mural work of that's in East LA. Just Google murals East Los Angeles. The history of the peoples are there. The Aztec, the Mayan history, the ancient, the United Farm Worker history, the strong women in the Mexican Revolution. It's all in the public. It's not even necessarily, you get more history of the Mexican Revolution and those murals than you do, I think, in Garfield High School.
See, that's the true purpose of art.
Yeah.
Especially in the African concept. Art is an instrument of instruction to the right side of the brain without saying a word.
And you're doing it here in
You
Natchez.
don't have to have a sentence or paragraph to explain it.
And you're doing it here because when I walked back from the museum and just kind of, rambled around, I mean, I see these incredible markers that you've created. When we were, historical markers, when we were in Montgomery, here's the last thing I'll say about this. Montgomery, Alabama, when I started going there in 1993, it was all about Montgomery is the capital of the first capital of the Confederacy. Our students walk through these blocks that the Equal Justice Initiative every year has put up 2 or 3 new markers. We now know where the slave market was. We know where Rosa Parks sat down. We know where she was arrested. We know all these aspects, even beyond just the civil rights movement, thanks to this incredible institution and a supportive community. Montgomery is obviously still problematic, but it's changing. Yeah.
To build on what both of you gentlemen brought up, one thing that I've noticed between my children have been in a much better situation since then. They're in a brand new school that has a lot of the things that you would expect a school to have, less chaos. I'm also in a school that has a lot more structure and support and things as you have. But both of you gentlemen are talking about things children need that require community. And unfortunately, in not every single neighborhood is that sense of community there. Things like art that respond to the whole child. Like, you cannot teach someone and expect them to be an excellent student until you're meeting all their needs as a person. And in some areas, where children experience trauma between when they wake up and when they walk through the school door, there are needs that are required to be met before they can function in any educational capacity. That I think is in some of the schools that struggle the most. That's something that still really needs to be addressed.
But that's a new demand upon schools. It's been there for about 40 years now. The socializing, teaching, parenting type of stuff. You got to address that now in school. But they don't teach you training in school to do that.
Right.
It's actually gotten much worse.
Yeah. Well, I said it's been there for 40 years.
Depends where you're at, depends on the level of support, and really your level of funding.
And the grandparents
Yeah,
are
I
raising
hear
the
you.
children.
But I quit my PhD program at Antioch of Ohio after I went to Africa and saw people in abject poverty. People on welfare had more materialism than these folks in Africa, but they could run, in terms of running, they could run circles around the folks in America. They didn't have lights in the school, they didn't have air conditioning, they didn't have windows, they didn't have computers and what have you. And I'm saying, oh, there's something going wrong in America. It must be in the water. I'm going to write my PhD on that. And I know why we had an argument. These are two Jewish professors. The system says poverty and what have you is the cause of crime and all that other kind. And I'm going to come along and get a PhD out of the system saying it ain't? No, they wasn't going to give me. I said, you stick your PhD up your ass. I'm paying for it. I don't need it. Okay, but that's why I don't have my PhD. I knew exactly what they were saying, particularly if they were of the Jewish religion, because the Jews have defined us for years and years, the Selniks and all those kinds of things. And I put that in my books about, you know, how Moynihan, black folks would be at the best, drawers of water and hewers of wood. That's Moynihan, the U.S. Senator. Okay, that's his classification socially of what's going to happen to us. We have to fight that kind of stuff. But I guess it's interesting why I don't have a PhD. And of course, I wouldn't last 5 minutes in your system that teaches the other lesson plan, because I wouldn't go with it.
Right. Well, you're the person who's taken us out to interview a lot of amazing people, though. You know, so I mean, from our perspective, yeah.
That's you know.
Yeah.
That's the other part of it.
Yeah.
You know, we can't do. We don't need no PhD to do that.
And see, that's where, and I'll conclude with this, because I know the hour's kind of getting late. How can I use oral history as an educator? I mean, again, that's what you're doing here in Natchez, right? I mean, you are encouraging this dialogue across generations, because that's another problem that ails this society, I can tell you as an oral historian, is young people not talking to older folks. You know, why is it that young people put their heads in the desk when you start talking about slavery? Or an elder starts talking, and kids are like, well, I don't have anything to do with that. That's why oral history is so important, to get people talking who normally don't talk with each other.
The people we've been interviewed, those are real laboratories that you tried to, when the state of Mississippi passed a law that you have to teach civil rights from K through 12, you go into the local school system here and ask them where's the curriculum, how to develop it, and what are they going to do. I'm saying these people that we just interview every year, that's your laboratory. This is you bring them live into the.
It should be.
It
should be.
But that ain't in the lesson plan for passing the test at the end of the year.
Yeah.
Raising the scores, for which the Democrat, the local newspaper, and everybody else hop on and criticize where the schools are not good. The scores, test scores.
Yeah.
And when you get out of school, who cares about a test score?
We got to change the calculus.
When you
You're
get
right.
out there struggling in the world.
All right, everyone. Well, thank you for your patience. I guess we'll kind of wrap up. And there's still food, right? There's still some food, Kathy? Please get, there's desserts. So yes. The cake.
Pound cake.
Pound cake, yeah. All right.
Pound cake.
Thanks, everyone.